Colonial America, the shocking trust behind America versus Mexico border. From first contact to the present, the land that now forms the United States and Mexico has been shaped by empires, wars, migration, commerce, broken promises, and recurring contests over sovereignty. The story of the US-Mexico border is not a single event, but a long sequence of treaties, opportunism, population movements, economic integration, and security dramas. A history in which trust was repeatedly forged, betrayed, renegotiated, and weaponized. Below is a continuous narrator-style account tracing that history from the colonial era through the modern border-state reality. In the beginning, long before European arrival, indigenous peoples lived, traded, fought, and formed alliances across the region that would later become borderland. Communities such as the Apache, Comanche, Yaqui, and many others moved seasonally and maintained networks that ignored later imposed lines. Spanish explorers and colonists arrived in the 16th century, bringing missions, presidios, ranches, and an imperial claim that stretched north from central Mexico into modern-day Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. For centuries, the territory was integrated into New Spain's economy and social world. Sheep and cattle ranching, silver mines, mission systems, and indigenous labor and exchange connected communities across vast distances. Trust in borderland arrangements was local and practical. Alliances, trade, intermarriage, and negotiated peace between indigenous leaders and colonial authorities created patterns of cooperation and resentment. That pragmatism persisted even as Spain declined. In 1821, Mexico won independence from Spain and inherited northern provinces that were thinly populated, far from central control, and costly to defend. The Mexican government encouraged settlement to assert control. Anglo-American pioneers, entrepreneurs, and speculators, including large numbers into Texas, accepted cheap land and were lured by local autonomy. Tensions grew between Mexico's centralizing laws, including restrictions on slavery and insistence on Catholic institutions, and Anglo settlers' expectations. The collapse of political trust accelerated into armed conflict. By 1836, Anglo settlers in Texas declared independence. The Republic of Texas existed for nearly a decade with support from many Americans. Mexico never fully recognized the break. For many in the expanding United States, Texas's eventual annexation, 1845, fed a doctrine of manifest destiny, a belief that the U.S. would expand across the continent. When the United States moved to annex Texas and pursue a Pacific port, confrontation with Mexico was almost inevitable. The Mexican-American War, 1846-1848, was decisive. U.S. military victories, political bargaining, and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, 1848, redrew the map. Mexico ceded roughly half its territory, present-day California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona and New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming, to the United States in exchange for $15 million and the assumption of certain claims. The treaty promised that Mexicans living in the ceded territories would be afforded property and civil rights as U.S. citizens. But in practice, legal maneuvering, land title disputes, and outright dispossession stripped many Mexican-origin landowners of property and status. The trust embedded in the treaty's legal language was frequently undermined by local courts, squatters, and state policies. The result was broad social and economic displacement of Mexican communities in the new U.S. Southwest. From the mid-19th century into the early 20th, the border region evolved with railroads, mining booms, and cross-border commerce. Migration flowed both ways. Farm laborers and ranch hands, seasonal workers, and entire families crossed the border in response to economic demand. Periodic violence erupted, banditry, vigilante justice, and clashes tied to the U.S. Civil War, and later the Mexican Revolution, 1910-1920. The Mexican Revolution in particular reshaped the border. Refugees, revolutionaries, and displaced populations flowed north. U.S. military expeditions, including the 1916 Pershing raid into Mexico chasing Pancho Villa, exposed the fragility of diplomatic trust and underscored that border control could erupt into armed confrontation. The 20th century brought new kinds of trust, economic and institutional, but also new betrayals. During World War I and especially World War II, U.S. industry's labor shortages encouraged the development of formal guest worker arrangements. The Bracero Program, 1942-1964, legalized the recruitment of Mexican farm laborers to work temporarily in the United States. Millions participated. For the U.S. agricultural economy, this was a pragmatic partnership. For many Mexican workers, it represented both opportunity and exploitation. Low pay, poor living and working conditions, and weaknesses in legal protections. When the Bracero program ended, demand for cheap labor persisted and migration dynamics shifted into unauthorized flows. Throughout, U.S. immigration policy often mixed economic pragmatism with exclusionary politics, enforcing some guest programs while simultaneously tightening other channels. Economic integration deepened in the late 20th century. The North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, 1994, created a new era of trade linkage. Factories, maquiladoras, proliferated just south of the border to take advantage of lower wages and proximity to U.S. markets. Supply chains tied northern consumers to southern labor. NAFTA increased goods flow and investment, but also intensified unequal development. Some border cities boomed while rural Mexican communities faced disruption. The trust underpinning trade agreements assumed institutions would manage displacement and provide equitable benefit sharing, an assumption that often failed, fueling migration driven by economic marginalization as much as family reunification. Parallel to trade-driven integration, the late 20th and early 21st centuries saw a securitization of the border. Political debates in the U.S. increasingly framed unauthorized migration as a problem of illegal entry and national security. Enforcement policies hardened. Increased patrols, fencing, interior enforcement, and technological surveillance raised the physical and legal cost of crossing. These changes had paradoxical effects. As crossing became more dangerous and expensive, migrants relied on smugglers, but were also less likely to return home after seasonal work. This shifted patterns from circular migration toward more permanent settlement in the U.S. The human toll, drownings, disappearances, detention of families, exposed a moral crisis in policies that prioritized deterrence over humanitarian protections or comprehensive legal pathways. The shocking trust at the heart of U.S.-Mexico border history often refers to the repeated reliance on shaky bargains, treaties that promised rights and failed to protect them, labor programs that relied on migrant labor while denying long-term rights, trade deals premised on shared prosperity that left many behind, and security arrangements that outsourced humanitarian responsibility to local communities and NGOs. Trust was repeatedly extended for pragmatic ends and then broken when political priorities shifted. From the Mexican side, the border has been both an economic lifeline and a source of vulnerability. Mexico's own political evolutions, post-revolutionary centralization, long one-party rule, economic liberalization, and the violent rise of powerful criminal cartels in the 1990s and 2000s complicated bilateral trust. The illicit drug trade introduced a new axis of conflict. Cartels trafficked drugs north and money. Guns and violence moved south. U.S. demand and the flow of weapons, including from LAX gun markets, fueled cartel power. Cooperation on law enforcement increased in scope, with programs like the Merida Initiative in 2008. But trust was fragile. Corruption, impunity, and differing priorities often undermined joint efforts. After the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, U.S. policy reframed borders as critical to national security, shifting immigration enforcement into homeland security priorities and creating new institutions, e.g., the Department of Homeland Security. This reframing accelerated the militarized aspect of border policy and tightened asylum processes, while humanitarian organizations warned that refugees fleeing violence, including cartel-related insecurity in Mexico and Central American countries, were being funneled into dangerous and legally fraught channels. In recent decades, the border has been a theater for politics and symbolism within both countries. US electoral debates use the border to mobilize constituencies, invoking images of invasion, crime, or economic displacement, while Mexican politicians have navigated domestic pressures and bilateral needs. Migrant caravans, family separations, mass deportations, and legal battles over asylum processes have become headline issues. Yet, despite tensions, the border remains one of the world's most active economic frontiers. Billions of dollars in trade cross daily. Binational metropolitan areas functionally integrate labor and commerce, and families routinely navigate bicultural lives. Today, the legacy is mixed. Markets, families, and communities tie both nations together in ways that make extreme decoupling impractical, but unresolved structural issues, inequality, weak legal protections for migrants, persistent violence, and political opportunism ensure cycles of mistrust. Crucially, the border's history shows that formal treaties and agreements often matter less than how they are implemented and enforced at local levels. Promises written in capitals are only as strong as the institutions, will, and resources that back them up locally. So where does shock fit into this history? It appears in repeated revelations. Treaties that promised citizenship and property rights but resulted in dispossession. Labor arrangements that acknowledged dependence but refused long-term rights. Security crackdowns that produced humanitarian crises. And trade policies that increased GDP while hollowing out livelihoods. The shock is not a single betrayal, but a pattern. Geopolitical and economic decisions made by elites, often collaborating across borders for profit or security, while ordinary people, indigenous communities, Mexican landowners, migrant laborers, border city residents shoulder the consequences. Looking forward, the border's future depends on reframing trust not as episodic bargains, but as durable frameworks that protect rights and livelihoods. That requires honest bilateral dialogue about asylum, legal migration pathways, labor protections, harm reduction strategies, anti-corruption measures, and development investments that address root causes of migration. It requires treating border communities as stakeholders rather than merely sites of enforcement. It requires acknowledging historical betrayals and designing institutions that are transparent, accountable, and humane. The story of the US-Mexico border is therefore not merely a sequence of walls and checkpoints, treaties and tariffs, or crime headlines. It is a long human story of adaptation and resistance, of economies and families woven across an imposed line, and of recurring moments where trust, fragile, negotiated, and too often broken, determined outcomes. Understanding that history is essential for anyone who wants to change what comes next. In the beginning, long before any flags were raised or borders were drawn, the lands that now form the United States and Mexico were one vast living network. Tribes traded, hunted, married, and fought across it. Apache, Comanche, Yaqui, and countless others, free to move through open horizons where no empire yet dared to claim ownership. Then came the Spanish. They planted missions, presidios, and ranches across the northern frontier, building churches of stone and carving trails of silver and blood. For 3 centuries, these lands were known as New Spain, a borderless world held together by religion, trade, and fragile peace with the indigenous nations. Trust in those days was local and uncertain. It was built through treaties written not on paper, but in survival. Promises between priests and warriors, between settlers and chiefs. When Mexico won independence from Spain in 1821, it inherited an enormous, thinly settled frontier. The new nation dreamed of uniting its people under one flag, but distance, poverty, and ambition tore those dreams apart. To populate its northern lands, Mexico invited settlers from the United States, offering land to those who would pledge loyalty. But with them came foreign ideals: Protestantism, slavery, and a hunger for self-rule. What began as cooperation soon became betrayal. By 1836, those settlers, mostly from the United States, declared Texas independent. Mexico called it treason. The young Republic of Texas called it destiny. And behind them, the United States waited, watching and planning. For many in Washington, Texas was the first step toward an empire stretching to the Pacific. They called it manifest destiny, the belief that God had chosen America to expand. Mexico saw it as theft. In 1845, Texas joined the United States, and in 1846, war erupted. The Mexican-American War was brutal, short, and decisive. When the smoke cleared, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed. Mexico was forced to give up half its territory. California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. In return, the United States paid $15 million, a small price for an empire of gold, rivers, and coastlines. The treaty promised rights to Mexicans who remained in the ceded lands. It promised that their property, their culture, and their citizenship would be respected. But that trust was a lie. Courts rewrote titles, settlers seized ranches, and Spanish-speaking families who had lived there for centuries were pushed aside. In the new American Southwest, trust became another word for loss. The late 19th century transformed the borderlands again. Railroads, mining, and new cities connected both sides. Mexican labor crossed north, American money flowed south. The border was alive, but restless. Bandits, revolutionaries, and soldiers haunted its deserts. In 1910, the Mexican Revolution shattered the old order. Hundreds of thousands fled north, seeking safety. The United States, fearing chaos, sent troops deep into Mexican soil to hunt Pancho Villa, a move that poisoned diplomatic trust for decades. Yet when the world went to war, cooperation returned. During World War II, the Bracero program invited Mexican workers to America's farms and railways. For 2 decades, millions labored under contracts that promised fair pay and respect. But once again, promises faded into exploitation. Low wages, discrimination, and abuse followed them across every field. When the program ended, the need for cheap labor did not. Illegal migration rose, and with it, new walls of suspicion. Then came a new kind of trust, written not in ink, but in trade. In 1994, the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, was signed. It promised prosperity for all, open markets, booming industries, and a shared future. Factories multiplied along the Mexican side of the border, producing goods for American shelves. But while profits soared, wages stayed low. Small farmers in Mexico, crushed by cheap imports, lost their land and crossed north in search of work. NAFTA had united economies, but divided lives. And as trade opened, the border hardened. Fences rose, agents multiplied, migrants died in deserts that once promised hope. Each year, trust eroded, between nations, between people, between promises and reality. After the attacks of September 11th, the border was transformed once more. No longer a line of commerce and culture, it became a wall of fear. Security replaced cooperation. Migrants became suspects, children were caged, families torn apart. Asylum turned into a battlefield of paperwork and politics. And through it all, both nations claimed to act in good faith. But history whispers another truth, that the US-Mexico border has never truly been about safety. It has been about control. Control of land, control of labor, control of destiny. Today, billions of dollars cross that line every day. So do families, dreams, and heartbreaks. The border is both a wound and a bridge, dividing nations that cannot live apart. Behind every treaty and every promise, there lies a hidden truth. That trust has always been a currency, spent freely, broken often, and repaid by those who had no choice but to believe again. From ancient tribes to colonial empires, from war to trade, from hope to betrayal, the story of America and Mexico is not just about a line on a map. It is about how power defines trust, and how trust, once lost, leaves scars that no treaty can heal. The 21st century stands at the border's edge, a place where history, politics, and humanity collide every single day. To understand the border today, we must see beyond the walls, beyond the headlines, and beyond the politics that twist its story into slogans. Because behind every checkpoint and policy, there are people. And behind every handshake between leaders, there is a question. Can trust ever truly return? The modern border begins with division, not just between nations, but within them. In the United States, immigration became more than a policy debate. It became a test of identity. To some, the border symbolizes national sovereignty, a defense against chaos and crime. To others, it represents a moral wound, proof that America's promise of liberty still depends on where you were born. Politics made the border a stage. In the 2010s, election rallies echoed with chants of walls and fear. Images of migrants in detention centers filled the news, sparking outrage and denial in equal measure. The truth was far less dramatic, yet far more painful. A humanitarian crisis decades in the making. By the late 2010s, the line between Mexico and the United States had become one of the most heavily monitored borders on Earth. Drones flew overhead. Infrared cameras watched the night. Digital databases tracked every fingerprint, every visa, every mile crossed. But technology, for all its precision, could not solve the oldest problem of all: human desperation. Families fleeing gang violence in Central America still made their way north, risking everything through jungles and deserts. Mothers carried their children through rivers. Teenagers rode atop freight trains known as La Bestia, the Beast, where one slip meant death. They came not for greed, but for safety, for hope, for survival. And when they reached the border, they faced another kind of wall, a system built to question their pain. On the Mexican side, the story is just as complex. Border towns like Tijuana, Ciudad Juárez, and Reynosa pulse with contradictions. Booming factories beside poverty, opportunity beside fear. For many locals, the border is not a barrier, but an economy, a way of life that feeds on the flow of goods, money, and migrants. Every day, more than $1 billion in trade crosses through official ports. Every night, smugglers and cartels find their own routes through the darkness. And through it all, both nations continue their uneasy partnership. The United States funds Mexico's enforcement efforts, training border guards and sharing intelligence. Mexico, in turn, acts as a buffer, detaining Central American migrants long before they reach the US line. It's a system built not on equality, but on necessity. A deal born from fear, not trust. Then came the pandemic. In 2020, the border closed for nearly everything, except trade. Factories slowed, tourism died, and families were divided overnight. Yet the supply chains kept moving, revealing the truth that politicians often hide. The two nations are inseparable. The border may divide flags, but not economies, not families, and not futures. When the world reopened, the old pressures returned. Migration waves larger than ever, asylum systems overwhelmed, and cartels adapting to new opportunities. Fentanyl, a synthetic drug deadlier than anything before, became the new plague crossing north. Its profits built empires in Mexico and devastation in American towns. Both governments blamed each other. Neither could fully control it. And yet, amid crisis, there are glimmers of renewal, local initiatives, humanitarian shelters, legal aid networks, and binational student programs are redefining what the border can mean. In places like El Paso and Ciudad Juárez, communities on both sides cooperate to share resources, culture, and compassion. They refuse to let politics erase humanity. Trust, after all, is not rebuilt by treaties or walls. It is rebuilt by people, ordinary citizens who see the border not as a scar, but as a shared heartbeat. Teachers who educate across two nations, doctors who treat patients without asking for papers, families who celebrate life together under two flags. The future of the border will not be decided by who builds the tallest wall or signs the latest policy. It will be decided by whether both nations can face their shared truth. That migration is not a threat. It is the oldest human story. That security cannot exist without justice, and that a line drawn in the sand cannot define who deserves dignity. The border is changing again, not vanishing, but transforming. Artificial intelligence tracks crossings, surveillance towers replace guards. But in the quiet spaces between those machines, life continues. Street markets, music, prayers, and laughter that flow freely through fences of steel. In the end, the story of the US-Mexico border is not about separation. It is about interdependence, about two nations forever tied by blood, history, and necessity, about centuries of promises made and broken, and the stubborn hope that one day trust will mean something real again. Because if history teaches anything, it is this: empires may rise and fall, walls may crumble, but the human will to connect, to trade, to love, to move, that can never be fenced in. And so, the border stands, not just as a line between nations, but as a mirror of who we are. A reminder that every time trust is betrayed, humanity must choose to rebuild it, not through fear, but through understanding, through compassion, through the courage to see our neighbors not as strangers, but as reflections of ourselves. When most people think of the US-Mexico border, they see fences, soldiers, and surveillance towers. They hear stories of conflict, crime, and control. But there is another border, a hidden one, alive in the music, the food, the laughter, and the daily exchanges that never make the news. A border that refuses to divide. In cities like San Diego and Tijuana, El Paso and Ciudad Juárez, Brownsville and Matamoros, the line between two nations is almost invisible. Families cross daily to work, to study, to visit loved ones, or to celebrate life. Children grow up speaking two languages, living in two cultures, and calling both sides home. Their accents may blend, their currencies may differ, but their hearts beat to the same rhythm. This is the human border, where trade and trust have built a culture stronger than any wall. Here, the smell of tacos and barbecue mix in the air. The music of mariachi meets the twang of country guitars, and friendships rise from the same soil that once saw armies march. Trade flows like blood through these arteries of connection. Every day, trucks carry food, cars, technology, and materials across ports that feed both nations. A single avocado picked in Michoacán can end up in a salad in Los Angeles within days. Factories in Mexico assemble cars designed in Detroit. American farmers rely on Mexican labor, while Mexican industries depend on American machinery. Their economies are not rivals, they are partners in a dance older than politics. Yet, even deeper than trade is culture, the invisible bond that no treaty can measure. The border has birthed a shared identity, fronterizo, neither fully American nor fully Mexican, but something beautifully in between, a blend of resilience and creativity that refuses to be caged by nationality. Artists paint murals on the walls that once sought to divide them, turning steel into canvas and protest into poetry. Songs born in these towns tell stories of struggle and pride, loss and belonging. They carry the voices of those who live with one foot in each world. Somos uno, they sing, we are one. Food tells the same story. In every border town, kitchens mix traditions. Tex-Mex, Cali-Mex, Norteño, where chilies, cheese, and corn become symbols of survival. Every dish is a quiet rebellion, a reminder that culture cannot be fenced in. Education, too, has built unseen bridges. Binational schools and exchange programs allow students to study across the border, learning not just languages, but empathy. They grow up seeing each other not as enemies, but as neighbors, teammates, and friends. And in their eyes, the future looks far less divided. Even in faith, the border has found harmony. Churches on both sides hold joint services, praying for migrants, for peace, for justice. Their prayers cross walls more easily than any passport ever could, because faith, like love, knows no checkpoint. And yet, this hidden border faces its own struggles. Cartels, corruption, and fear threaten the fragile balance that communities work so hard to keep. But every time violence tears something down, people rebuild, quietly, stubbornly, together. It is this spirit that defines the border more than any wall or war ever could. In the quiet evenings of border towns, when the sun sets over the Rio Grande or the Pacific coast, life feels unified. Music drifts across fences. Lights flicker on both sides, shining the same warm glow. And in that moment, the illusion of separation fades. Two nations, two cultures, one heartbeat. The border has always been portrayed as a wound, but perhaps it is also a scar that heals. A reminder of the pain that once was, and the strength that endures. Because every day, people here choose connection over division. They choose cooperation over fear. They choose to live not in spite of the border, but through it. The hidden border is proof that humanity is stronger than politics. It whispers a truth that history too often forgets. That trust can be rebuilt not by governments, but by ordinary people, by farmers, teachers, merchants, and mothers who see humanity before nationality. In the end, the US-Mexico border is more than geography. It is a living story of trade and tragedy, hope and hardship, love and loss. It is a mirror showing us that what divides nations can also unite them. that every wall can become a bridge if people have the courage to walk across it. And so, the border stands, scarred but breathing, divided but alive. It stands as a monument not to separation, but to endurance. A symbol of how trust, even when shattered, can be reborn in the hearts of those who refuse to give up on it. Because the spirit of the border, this hidden human border, will always belong not to governments or generals, but to the people who live in its shadow and choose every single day to turn that shadow into light.